Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Ryan piloting Godo, Bandit Warlord. This deck seeks to ramp as much as possible on mana. It then casts its commander, fetches up Helm of the Host, and wins with infinite combat. Next, we have Sasha piloting the partner pair of Rograkh, Son of Rograkh, and Silas Wren, Seeker Adept. This deck attempts to resolve a massive card advantage engine like Ad Nauseam or Necropotence as soon as possible. It then closes out the game with Underworld Breach or Thassa's Oracle. After that, we have Andy piloting Derevi, Imperial Tactician. This deck seeks to leverage Derevi's untap abilities to gain advantage. It pairs light stacks pieces to help control the board before performing infinite loops with Derevi or Emil the Blessed. Finally, we have Brian piloting Nadu, Winged Wisdom. This deck seeks to use Nadu's ability for ramp and card advantage. It uses cards like Field of the Dead and Scoot Swarm to fuel more creatures for Nadu and wins the game with combat. Without further ado, let's kick off as Two-Toed Twitching Twister. Sasha had the longest, fun, and energetic plank and gets to start us off. Sasha draws a card for turn and plays a Wooded Foothills. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Raucous Theater onto the battlefield tapped. It enters, and she surveils the Gemstone Caverns into her graveyard. She passes. Andy draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Mana Crypt and passes. Brian draws, plays a City of Brass, and ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He ships the turn. Sasha draws and casts her commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. She casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Rograkh as an additional cost, adding 4 black. She casts Arcane Signet. She casts Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, Sasha pings Ryan for 1, and then amasses Orcs 1. Sasha passes. At the end of Sasha's turn, Andy casts Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Captain Sisay onto the top of his library. During his upkeep, Andy loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Bountiful Promenade. He casts Captain Sisay. Andy passes. Brian draws and plays a Hedge Maze onto the battlefield tapped. It enters, and Brian surveils the forest into his graveyard. He ends his turn. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a mountain for turn. He casts Mox Opal. He ships the turn to Sasha. Sasha draws and plays a City of Traders for turn. She casts Grim Tutor. She fetches up a card into her hand and loses 3 life. She moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Orcish Bowmasters and her Orc army. Ryan takes it, and Sasha gives the turn to Andy. During his upkeep, Andy loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Captain Sisay, fetching up a Gaia's Cradle into his hand. He plays Gaia's Cradle for turn. He casts his commander, Derevi, Imperial Tactician. It enters, and Andy untaps Bountiful Promenade. He casts Nomads Uncore. Andy ships the turn. Brian draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He passes. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Manifold Key onto the battlefield. He plays a Great Furnace for turn. He casts a Grim Monolith. Knowing that 0 interaction has been used this game, Ryan passes. Sasha draws and casts Wheel of Fortune. In response, Brian casts Pongify, targeting Orcish Bowmasters. Bowmasters dies, and Sasha creates a 3/3/8. In response to Wheel, Ryan casts Seething Song, adding 5 red. He casts Thunderclap, killing Captain Sisay. Then each player discards their hand and draws 7. Next, Sasha plays a Phyrexian Tower for turn. City of Traders triggers, and she sacrifices it. She activates Phyrexian Tower, sacrificing her Orc army, adding 2 black. She casts Talisman of Dominance. Sasha ends her turn. During his upkeep, Andy wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts Mox Amber. He casts Thrasios, Triton Hero. He casts Rhystic Study. He casts Polywog Prodigy. He moves to combat and attacks Sasha with Derevi and Brian with Nomads. In response, Sasha casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Derevi. Rhystic triggers, and Andy draws. Derevi bounces, Andy sacks a land, copies the chain, targeting Mox Amber. Amber bounces, and Andy stops the chain. Then Brian takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Andy recasts Mox Amber. He passes. At the end of Andy's turn, Brian cracks his Windswept Teeth, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield tapped. Brian draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn. He casts Birds of Paradise. Rhystic triggers, and Brian pays. Brian passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Crystal Vein for turn. He casts Goblin Engineer, paying the Rhystic tax. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Defense Grid into his graveyard. Ryan ends his turn. Sasha draws and plays a polluted Delta. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an underground sea onto the battlefield. She activates Phyrexian Tower, sacrificing her ape, adding 2 black. She casts Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Andy draws. Then she fetches up a card into her hand. She casts Necropotence. Rhystic triggers and Andy draws again. She activates Necropotence 9 times, paying 9 life, exiling 9 cards. She moves to her end step and puts the Necro cards into her hand. She passes, discarding to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. During his upkeep, Andy loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He recasts his commander, Derevi. It enters and Polywog and Derevi trigger. Andy floats mana, then untaps his Guy's Cradle. Then Polywog gets a counter. He casts Court of Calling, where X equals 3. In response, Sasha taps her Talisman to cast Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Cord. Rhystic and Polywog trigger, and Andy draws 2. Then Andy pays for Flusterstorm, and Cord resolves. He fetches up a Nadu, Winged Wisdom, onto the battlefield. Next, Andy activates Nomads and Core, targeting itself. Nadu triggers and Andy reveals a Spellseeker into his hand. He activates Nomads again, targeting itself. Nadu triggers and he reveals a Phyrexian Metamorph into his hand. He activates Nomads, targeting Thrasios. Nadu triggers and he reveals a Path to Exile into his hand. He activates Nomads, targeting Thrasios again. Nadu triggers and he reveals a Wooded Foothills onto the battlefield. He activates Nomads, targeting Nadu. Nadu triggers and Andy reveals a Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy into his hand. He activates Nomads, targeting Nadu. Nadu triggers and he reveals a Mana Confluence onto the battlefield. He activates Nomads, targeting Derevi. Nadu triggers and he reveals an Eldritch Evolution into his hand. He activates Nomads, targeting Derevi again. Nadu triggers and he reveals a Ranger Captain Abios into his hand. He activates Nomads, targeting Polywog Prodigy. Nadu triggers and he reveals a Birthing Pod into his hand. He activates Nomads, targeting Polywog again. Nadu triggers and he reveals a Savannah onto the battlefield. Andy cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Cutsil, Malamet Exemplar. After some deliberation from the table, Brian responds by tapping his City of Brass to cast Chain of Vapor, targeting Derevi, paying for Rhystic. Polywog triggers and Andy draws a card. In response, Andy casts Pact of Negation, countering Chain. Then Cutsil resolves. Polywog triggers and gets a counter. Andy moves to combat and attacks Sasha with Polywog, Thrasios, and Nomads. Sasha takes it, Cutsil triggers, and Derevi triggers 3 times. Andy untaps Guy's Cradle, Mana Crypt, and Bountiful Promenade, then draws through Cutsil. In his second main phase, he activates Nomads, targeting Cutsil. Nadu triggers and he reveals an Arid Mesa onto the battlefield. He activates Nomads, targeting Cutsil again. Nadu triggers and he reveals a Delny, Streetwise Lookout into his hand. Next, Andy casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Thrasios as an additional cost. He fetches up an Emil the Blessed onto the battlefield. Andy activates Emil, targeting Derevi. Derevi flickers and triggers, untapping Guy's Cradle. Andy presents a loop of tapping Guy's Cradle for 6, then activating Emil, targeting Derevi. Since Derevi is a new instance every time, Nadu will trigger. Each time Derevi flickers, he untaps Guy's Cradle. He adds infinite greens, puts all lands onto the battlefield, and then the rest of his library into his hand through Nadu. He then flickers Derevi with Emil, untapping his other lands to generate infinite white and blue. He casts Blind Obedience. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 3. He fetches up an Eternal Witness from his graveyard onto the battlefield. He casts Snap, targeting Eternal Witness, extorting it through Blind Obedience, with each opponent losing 1 and Andy gaining 3. Eternal Witness bounces, and he untaps 2 lands. He recasts Eternal Witness, extorting it through Blind Obedience. Witness enters, and Andy returns Snap to his hand. Andy presents a loop of casting Eternal Witness, returning Snap to his hand, then casting Snap to bounce Witness, and then untap 2 lands. Each time he casts these spells, he extorts it through Blind Obedience. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Andy wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a match. Congrats to Andy on his win. His knowledge and experience with Derevi really was in full force tonight. Even when players were interacting, he had the ability to navigate the board, sequence his plays correctly, and close it out in impressive fashion. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Nadu. It is not even close that this was the MVP of tonight's game. Nadu gave Andy so many cards in one turn, and he leveraged Nomads and Core in order to keep the triggers going. Many didn't see it coming and couldn't do much to stop it once it hit the battlefield. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.